As Richard's fury exploded, he lunged at Judge Williams, grabbing his collar, eyes blazing. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, voice trembling with barely controlled rage. Patrons gasped, some stifling laughter as Williams, unfazed, calmly replied, "Better? I'm just doing my job, Captain." Richard, red-faced and sputtering, retorted, "Your job? Passing judgment on me?" Williams smirked. "Looks like that's what I'm here for tonight." Captain Richard Morse sat in his office, the faint glow of the setting sun casting shadows across the room. Decades of service as a police officer had hardened his demeanor and cemented his authority within the precinct. Known for his no-nonsense approach, he was respected, feared, and by many accounts, untouchable. His badge wasn't just a symbol of his job. It was a shield, a way to enforce his beliefs and authority over others. Beneath his stoic exterior, however, Richard harbored views he rarely voiced but never wavered on. Tradition, for him, wasn't just about respecting laws. It was about maintaining control, and he felt strongly about who he believed should wield that control. Richard's world, however, was about to be upended by his son, Evan Moore. At 21, Evan was impulsive but generally well-meaning, a young man growing up under the watchful and often suffocating gaze of his father. While Evan tried to find his place in the world, he was constantly reminded of his father's expectations and the weight of the family name. One evening, a phone call shattered Richard's carefully constructed world. Evan, out with friends, had been involved in a serious incident. After drinking too much, he had gotten into a scuffle that ended in property damage and injury to a bystander. In the heat of the moment, he had acted recklessly, and now he was facing criminal charges. Richard's mind swirled with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief, but he was certain he could use his connections to smooth things over. After all, he was Captain Moore. He could protect his son from the harshness of the law. In the days that followed, Richard made calls to old colleagues and friends in the legal system, seeking reassurance that Evan would receive leniency. However, to his shock, his influence didn't yield the results he had expected. The case was assigned to Judge Marcus Williams, a black judge with a reputation for fairness and integrity. Known for his commitment to justice, Williams had no inclination to bend the law, regardless of a defendant's status or family connections. Richard's disdain grew the more he learned about Williams. To him, Williams wasn't just another judge. He represented everything Richard had silently resisted, a world where the authority of men like him could be challenged by someone who didn't fit his traditional mold of power. Despite Williams' fair and even-handed reputation, Richard couldn't accept the idea of a black man holding his son's fate in his hands. The thought gnawed at him, deepening his prejudice and resentment. It was not just about Evan. It was about his own sense of control, his belief that he should be beyond the reach of any authority he didn't endorse. Richard had spent years bending the rules to protect himself and those close to him. The idea that someone, especially a black man, would enforce the law against his family, leaving him powerless, was unbearable. The day of Evan's sentencing arrived, and Richard walked into the courtroom with his son, his jaw set, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. The courtroom was a space Richard had often viewed as an extension of his own authority, a place where his connections and reputation had shielded him from uncomfortable consequences. But today felt different. Today, it was his son on trial, and the authority in question wasn't his own. It rested in the hands of Judge Marcus Williams. Judge Williams sat behind the bench, his presence calm and steady, radiating a quiet confidence that Richard found increasingly irritating. Williams was a seasoned judge, a man whose reputation for fairness had earned him respect and trust within the community. Though he was younger than Richard, he held himself with a gravitas that commanded attention. He was known for listening attentively, valuing both sides, and handing down judgments that balanced compassion with accountability. Richard watched as Judge Williams looked over Evan's case file, his face impassive yet focused. The judge raised his gaze to Evan, asking direct but fair questions, giving him the chance to speak in his own defense. Evan, visibly remorseful, admitted to his mistakes, his voice breaking slightly as he apologized for the harm he had caused. He expressed a willingness to make amends, though Richard's face tightened at seeing his son, the product of his upbringing, show such vulnerability under Williams' scrutiny? After listening to Evan and reviewing the circumstances, Judge Williams delivered his sentence: a year of probation and 200 hours of community service. It was a fair sentence, one that would allow Evan to learn responsibility without the harshness of prison time. Williams' intention was clear: to give Evan an opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to make amends. But to Richard, this decision was a slap in the face. The sentence was, in his mind, a form of public humiliation. For his son, Captain Richard Moore's son, to be subject to the oversight of probation and forced into community service was unacceptable. Richard sat rigidly, his expression hardening as he listened to Judge Williams outline the conditions of Evan's probation. He felt his authority slipping away with each word Williams spoke, his powerlessness in this moment inflaming his resentment. As Judge Williams concluded the session, he looked directly at Richard, his eyes briefly acknowledging the captain's presence. There was no malice in his expression, only a firm reminder that the law applied to everyone, regardless of their status. Richard's stomach twisted in response. This wasn't merely a matter of his son's actions. It was an affront to Richard's very sense of identity. He believed that men like him were meant to be above these kinds of judgments, immune from scrutiny. And yet here was this judge, a black man, exerting his authority over Richard's son as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As the courtroom emptied, Richard clenched his fists, his mind racing with indignation. To him, Judge Williams had crossed a line, one that defied his deeply held beliefs about race, authority, and power. How could a man like Williams dare to have control over his family's fate? The judge's calm professionalism only deepened Richard's rage, leaving him stewing with a dark determination. In Richard's mind, Williams represented the shift in society he'd long resisted, the idea that authority could be wielded by those he saw as unworthy of it. The more he thought about it, the more the idea consumed him. He couldn't stand the thought of Judge Williams, in his integrity and professionalism, overshadowing the legacy he had built. It wasn't just a verdict against his son. It was, in his mind, an insult directed at him, a personal challenge that demanded retaliation. As Richard left the courtroom with Evan by his side, he made a silent vow to himself. Judge Marcus Williams would pay for his insolence, not only for what he had done to Evan, but for daring to stand above him. Over the next week, Richard Moore's anger festered like a slow-burning fire, his resentment intensifying with each passing day. He couldn't get the courtroom scene out of his mind. Judge Williams' unwavering gaze, his calm voice delivering the sentence, and the way he'd barely acknowledged Richard's presence. It gnawed at him, a relentless reminder that he'd been forced to sit powerless while a black man passed judgment on his son. Every time he replayed the scene, it only strengthened his resolve. At the precinct, Richard threw himself into his work, but even routine cases couldn't distract him. His colleagues noticed his foul mood, his harsh tone, his sudden outbursts over minor issues, but none dared to ask what was wrong. To those around him, he was simply Captain Moore, and that title had always meant unquestioned respect. Yet, now, beneath his authoritative exterior, Richard felt a vulnerability he despised. In his mind, Judge Williams became a symbol of everything he feared losing: control, authority, and the respect he believed was his by birthright. Richard had grown up in a world where men like him held the power, where he could count on his status and connections to shield him and his family from consequences. He felt an entitlement to certain privileges, believing that the respect he commanded should extend beyond his professional life, protecting his family from those he viewed as lesser. As the week wore on, Richard began to fixate on Williams. He looked up articles about the judge, scrutinizing every detail. He discovered that Williams was well-liked, a respected figure within the judicial community known for his integrity and fairness. This only added fuel to Richard's resentment. To him, Williams' reputation was an affront, a reminder that society was moving away from the traditions he held dear, a world where people like Judge Williams could rise to positions of authority. Late one evening, after a long day, Richard sat alone in his dimly lit living room, nursing a drink. His thoughts drifted to his son, Evan, now a young man burdened by the consequences of his actions. consequences that Richard believed could have been avoided had it not been for that judge. The alcohol amplified his anger, loosening the reins he usually kept on his emotions. He began to talk aloud to himself, words laced with bitterness and fury. "This wouldn't have happened if things were as they should be," he muttered. "That judge. He thinks he's better than us, thinks he can punish my son, make a mockery of my family." In Richard's mind, William's judgment was a personal attack, a way of undermining everything he had worked for. He felt that his authority was slipping away, and it terrified him. He couldn't accept that a man like Williams, someone he deemed unworthy, could wield the power to impact his family's future. The thought twisted his sense of identity and left him seething with a bitterness he struggled to contain. Slowly, a dark idea began to form. He wanted revenge, not just for his son, but for the insult he believed Williams had directed at him personally. He didn't care that Williams had merely been doing his job or that Evan's punishment had been fair. To Richard, it was a matter of pride, of proving that no one, especially a black man, could hold power over him. He began to imagine scenarios, waiting for an opportunity to confront Williams. He wanted to see the judge's calm demeanor crack, to make him feel powerless, if only for a moment. In Richard's twisted view, this was justice, reclaiming his sense of superiority, restoring what he believed had been taken from him. A week later, fate placed Richard Moore and Judge Marcus Williams in the same small restaurant on the edge of town. It was early evening, and the dim lighting cast a calm ambience across the room. Richard spotted Williams almost immediately, seated alone at a corner table, his posture relaxed as he read a book, unaware of the storm brewing nearby. The sight of him, so composed and untroubled, sent a fresh surge of anger through Richard's veins. Without a second thought, Richard approached the judge's table, his footsteps heavy with intent. The closer he got, the more his heart pounded, fueled by a week's worth of resentment and sleepless nights replaying the courtroom scene. Williams looked up from his book as Richard loomed over the table, recognizing him instantly. Williams' expression remained calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise at the unexpected encounter. "Judge Williams," Richard greeted him, his voice a barely contained growl. He forced a smile that never reached his eyes, a thinly veiled mockery meant to unsettle the judge. "Captain Moore," Williams replied, his tone neutral yet firm. "What brings you here?" Richard pulled out the chair opposite Williams and sat without invitation, his posture tense. The air around them thickened as the sounds of clinking glasses and soft conversation faded into the background, leaving only the silence between them. "You think you can just hand down whatever sentence you like and walk away as if you're above everyone, don't you?" Richard's voice was low, but it held a sharp edge, a threat buried beneath his words. Judge Williams regarded him steadily. "Captain Moore, your son's case was judged fairly, and the sentence was meant to give him a chance to take responsibility for his actions. My duty is to uphold the law impartially, regardless of who sits before me." Richard clenched his fists under the table, the judge's calmness only fanning his anger. "Your duty?" he sneered. "What gives you the right to pass judgment on my son, on my family? Men like you don't get to decide our fate." Williams sighed, setting his book aside and meeting Richard's eyes directly. "With all due respect, Captain, the law is blind to race, status, or personal feelings. I'd hoped you would understand that by now." The response struck a nerve, and Richard felt his control slip. He leaned in, his face inches from the judge's. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? Because of that robe, that bench. But you're nothing. You hear me? Nothing compared to me. You might wear the title of judge, but you don't deserve to stand above men like me." The tension was palpable, and Williams noticed several patrons glancing in their direction, sensing the growing hostility at their table. Williams spoke calmly, his voice steady and unwavering. "Captain Moore, this isn't the place for this conversation. I suggest you let go of whatever grievance you hold. It will only destroy you." But Richard was beyond reason. His hand shot out, knocking Williams' book off the table, and he glared at the judge, daring him to react. "You don't tell me what to do." Richard spat, his voice rising. "You think you can sit there, passing judgment on me and my family just because you're protected by a title? The other patrons watched as Richard's composure unraveled. His voice grew louder, his face red with fury, until finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. He reached across the table, grabbing Williams by the collar. Williams remained calm, even as Richard's grip tightened, his face mere inches away. "I could end you right here," Richard hissed through gritted teeth, his voice a harsh whisper. "And no one would blame me." A hush fell over the room as the other diners stared, some frozen in shock, others pulling out their phones, ready to capture the altercation. But before anything else could happen, two nearby patrons intervened, pulling Richard off the judge. Richard struggled against them, his rage blinding him to reason, to the stares of everyone around them, to the repercussions of his actions. Judge Williams straightened his collar, remaining composed as he stood up. "Captain Moore, you've crossed a line tonight," he said, his voice unwavering. "And now, it's not me passing judgment on you. It's the law." Realizing what he'd done, Richard's bravado faded, leaving only a simmering shame and bitterness. But even in his humiliation, a dark satisfaction lingered in his mind. He had confronted Williams, had let him know, if only briefly, that his authority meant nothing to him. But that satisfaction was short-lived as two police officers entered the restaurant, alerted by the patrons. They walked over, their expressions stern as they handcuffed Richard, reading him his rights. In his mind, this was the ultimate disgrace, to be handled like a common criminal. His resentment boiled over into fury once again. But now, bound by his actions, he had no outlet for it. Judge Williams watched as Richard was led away, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. The law had brought them both to this moment, and now, the same law that Richard had once wielded was holding him accountable. The captain had misused his authority, blinded by prejudice, and now he would face the same justice he had once tried to control. As the clock struck midnight, Richard found himself once again in a courtroom, but this time, he was not a proud police captain observing from the sidelines. He stood as a defendant, the very position he had never imagined would be his, shackled by both handcuffs and the weight of his own actions. The sterile lights overhead illuminated the room, casting a harsh, unyielding glare on Richard, a reminder that the courtroom now held authority over him, a place he no longer controlled. Across the room, Judge Marcus Williams entered with quiet dignity, the same composed expression he had worn during Evan's sentencing. There was no gloating, no triumph in Williams' demeanor, only a solemn sense of duty. He took his place behind the bench, and as he looked out at the courtroom, he seemed not to see Richard as an enemy but as just another individual subject to the law. This neutrality infuriated Richard. How could the judge be so calm, so unshaken, after everything? Richard's own anger had fueled this entire confrontation, yet here was Judge Williams, unbothered, wielding power with ease, unscathed by Richard's rage. It was like pouring gasoline onto Richard's resentment, a feeling that still lingered despite his circumstances. The room was mostly empty, save for a few legal staff and officers. The late hour lent the proceedings an almost surreal quality, amplifying Richard's sense of isolation. In the silence that filled the courtroom, the judge's voice cut through, clear and steady. "Captain Richard Moore," Judge Williams began, looking down at the man who had tried to intimidate him just hours earlier. "You are here tonight facing charges of assault and disorderly conduct. You, a man entrusted with upholding the law, stand accused of violating it." The words hung in the air, each one a blow to Richard's pride. But what stung more was that they were true. His actions had betrayed everything he was supposed to stand for, and now, standing before the judge he had tried to undermine, he could feel the weight of his choices closing in on him. Richard felt a compulsion to speak, to defend himself, to reclaim some control, even if only through his words. The silence stretched, and finally, he broke it, his voice strained but filled with lingering defiance. "I did what I did because you," he spat the word, "dared to think you could control my family, my son. You have no idea what it's like to watch someone like you sit in judgment over what I've built." Judge Williams' gaze remained steady. He listened, allowing Richard to speak, to bear his resentment and his prejudice for all to see. When Richard finished, his breathing labored. The room was silent once again. The judge leaned forward slightly, his tone unyielding yet devoid of malice. "Captain Moore, it is not my duty to control anyone. My duty is to uphold justice, regardless of who stands before me. The law doesn't serve personal pride or family reputation. It serves the principles of fairness and accountability. You, of all people, should understand that." Richard scoffed, but the sound was hollow. He felt the truth of William's words resonate somewhere deep within him, a truth he wanted to ignore, but it clung to him stubbornly. His anger no longer had the same power. It felt empty, like a shield that had shattered under the weight of his own actions. Judge Williams continued, his voice unwavering. "Tonight, you crossed a line, Captain Moore. You allowed hatred and pride to cloud your judgment. You chose to abuse your authority because of your own biases, not because of any wrongdoing on my part. You sought to punish me for a sentence that was both fair and just." The words hit like a series of blows, stripping away Richard's defenses, laying bare the prejudice he had held onto so tightly. He had convinced himself that he was above others, that his position made him untouchable, that he didn't have to answer to anyone he considered beneath him. But here he stood, under the bright courtroom lights, unable to escape the reality of his actions. Williams took a deep breath, his voice softening slightly as he continued. "You are a man of authority, Captain, and with that authority comes responsibility. Yet tonight, you allowed that authority to twist into something ugly and dangerous. Misusing power is a betrayal not only of the people you swore to protect but of yourself." Richard felt a rare pang of shame, a sensation unfamiliar to him. In his mind, he could see Evan, his son, watching this moment, and the image left him hollow. All his life, he had wanted to pass on his values, his legacy, to his son. But now, he was faced with the truth. He had shown Evan only the worst of what power could become. After a long pause, Judge Williams pronounced the sentence. "For your actions tonight, you will be held accountable. Your badge does not exempt you from the law. Tonight, you are reminded that authority is not a weapon. It is a responsibility, one that you failed to uphold. You will face the consequences just as any other citizen would." The sentence, though modest in scope, was a public statement, a mark on Richard's record, a symbolic stripping of the power he had wielded so carelessly. The impact of it would echo in his career, his reputation, his standing among peers. But the greatest punishment, he realized, was the knowledge that he had let his own hatred blind him, that he had compromised everything he had built out of a misguided sense of superiority. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the session, Richard lowered his head, the last remnants of defiance leaving him. He had misused his power, allowed prejudice to guide his actions, and now, he would carry the weight of those choices, not as a proud police captain, but as a man humbled by his own failures. The courtroom emptied, leaving Richard alone with the reality of his actions and a lesson that he had resisted learning for far too long. Authority without integrity leads only to ruin. And in that silent, empty room, he finally understood that justice had been served, not by him, but upon him. The days following his court appearance weighed heavily on Richard Moore. Stripped of his badge temporarily and facing a suspension, he walked through life in a daze, grappling with a bitter cocktail of shame, regret, and lingering resentment. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though he was carrying the weight of his own misguided beliefs. Evan, who had once looked up to his father with a sense of pride and awe, now saw him with disappointment. Their conversations had become strained, their connection frayed by Richard's actions and the humiliating consequences that followed. Richard had wanted to protect his son from judgment, yet now Evan was the one bearing the weight of his father's disgrace. The day of his formal disciplinary hearing finally arrived. Richard sat in the same courthouse, this time before a review board comprising his own colleagues and senior officers, people who had once respected him, who had looked up to him as a symbol of authority and integrity. Now, their eyes held only scrutiny and disappointment. In that moment, he realized he had not only tarnished his own reputation but had eroded the trust of those who had served under him. As the hearing began, he was given the opportunity to speak, to explain his actions. For a long moment, he sat silently, his head bowed. But he knew he couldn't remain silent any longer. All the years he had spent asserting his authority, maintaining control, none of it mattered now if he couldn't face the truth. He took a deep breath and, for the first time, let his true feelings emerge. "I'll be honest," Richard began, his voice thick with a mixture of frustration and regret. "I acted out of anger and resentment. Judge Williams wasn't doing anything wrong. He was upholding the law, and my son received a fair sentence. But he faltered, the words catching in his throat, I couldn't accept that judgment coming from a black man. I told myself it was about protecting my son, but the truth is, it was my pride, my ego, that I was defending." The room was silent, but Richard could feel the tension thickening, his confession echoing in the stillness. He felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight was finally lifting off his shoulders, even as the shame of his admission settled deeper within him. "All my life," he continued, "I've held on to certain beliefs that I thought made me strong, that gave me control. But all they did was blind me. I used my badge, my position, to justify that prejudice, to try to intimidate Judge Williams and put him in his place. I thought I was above him because of who I am, but I was wrong." As he spoke, he glanced at Evan, who was sitting in the audience, listening intently. Seeing his son there, the shame deepened. But he knew this was a moment he couldn't walk away from. He had to make it right, for Evan's sake as much as his own. "I lost sight of what authority really means," Richard admitted, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I allowed my hatred to twist it into something destructive. Authority is meant to protect, not to harm, and I failed in that duty. My actions were a betrayal of everything I stood for, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." The review board listened, their faces a mixture of sternness and solemn understanding. They were silent for a long moment, allowing Richard's confession to settle. The weight of his actions was undeniable, yet so was his admission, raw and unfiltered, that revealed the depth of his remorse. One of the senior officers finally spoke. "Captain Moore, your confession here is a step in the right direction. You misused the authority entrusted to you, driven by personal bias. This cannot be overlooked. Your actions not only jeopardized your career, but compromised the trust placed in our department. However, by facing your prejudice and acknowledging your wrongs, you have shown that you understand the gravity of your actions." Richard was silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, bracing himself for the consequences. He knew he deserved punishment, not just for the sake of justice, but as a reminder of the lesson he had finally learned. The officer continued, "In light of your actions and your confession, you will be demoted and placed on probation, with mandatory counseling. We expect you to serve this community as a model of respect, responsibility, and equality. If you wish to regain the trust you've lost, it will not come through authority, but through humility and service." As the decision was made, Richard felt a strange mixture of shame and relief. He had lost his rank, his position, but perhaps in that loss, he had gained something more, a chance to rebuild, to confront the biases he had held for so long, to become a better man, not just a better officer. As he walked out of the courtroom, he looked once more at Evan, who stood in the hallway waiting for him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Richard saw not only the disappointment in his son's gaze, but a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Evan saw a man who, despite his faults, was willing to change, to make amends. For Richard, this was a turning point, a painful but necessary awakening. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. He would no longer misuse his authority to fuel his prejudices. Instead, he would use what remained of his career to teach others, especially his son, that authority, when misused, brings ruin, but when wielded with integrity, could bring healing, understanding, and change. Weeks turned into months, and as Richard Moore settled into his new role within the police department, he found himself working among those he once commanded. Stripped of his rank and the authority he'd once taken for granted, Richard felt a humility that he hadn't known before. He attended his mandatory counseling sessions with reluctance at first, But as he confronted the layers of resentment and prejudice he had harbored for so long, he began to see his actions in a stark, painful light. Counseling forced him to confront his own biases, to understand that his anger toward Judge Williams had been a reflection of his own insecurities. Slowly, he began to unpack the beliefs he had clung to for years, recognizing how they had distorted his perception of justice and power. In these sessions, he was challenged to see people for their character, not for their race or position, and to understand that true authority lay not in dominance but in respect. One day, during a particularly introspective session, his counselor posed a question that lingered with him long after he'd left. "What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind, Richard?" The question gnawed at him, unraveling memories of his life before that pivotal moment in court. He thought of his son, Evan, who had once idolized him but now looked at him with a mix of disappointment and guarded hope. He knew he had to make things right, not just for himself, but for the example he wanted to set for his son. Richard began taking small, deliberate steps toward change. He volunteered for community outreach programs, many of which served neighborhoods and communities he had once viewed with disdain. As he spent time listening to the stories and struggles of people from all backgrounds, he felt his perspective slowly shifting. Each interaction chipped away at the barriers he'd built within himself, allowing him to see the world through a new lens. In a twist of fate, he found himself working alongside Judge Williams in a community program aimed at reducing youth violence. At first, their interactions were terse and limited to formalities, but as they began to see each other in different contexts, Williams as a mentor to young people, Richard as a humbled officer working to make amends, the animosity between them softened. One evening, after a long day of outreach, Richard found himself walking alongside Williams. The judge, ever composed and patient, finally broke the silence. "You know," Williams began, glancing at Richard, "I didn't expect to see you here. But I'm glad you came." Richard, caught off guard, struggled to find the right words. I needed to be here. I needed to understand the damage I'd done, not just to others but to myself." Williams nodded, a slight smile crossing his face. "Redemption isn't easy, Richard, but it starts with accepting the truth about ourselves. I've seen men make worse mistakes than yours and still find a way back." They walked on in silence, the weight of those words settling within Richard. For the first time, he felt a genuine sense of respect for the judge, not as a man he once saw as a threat, but as someone who had extended him grace when he least deserved it. It was a moment of quiet reconciliation, a turning point that marked the beginning of a genuine understanding between them. Months later, Richard's story became a cautionary tale within the department. His colleagues saw the changes in him, the quiet humility with which he now approached his duties. He no longer viewed his role as a means of control but as a privilege, a chance to serve and protect with integrity. Evan, who had initially distanced himself from his father, gradually began to see the changes in Richard as well. Conversations that were once strained grew easier, filled with newfound openness and understanding. Richard shared his journey with his son, admitting his faults and explaining the hard-won lessons he had learned. He wanted Evan to understand that real strength came from recognizing one's own weaknesses and choosing to grow from them. Over time, Richard's story reached the wider community. He was invited to speak at events in schools, sharing his experiences and the lessons he had learned about authority, respect, and humility. Standing before audiences that spanned generations and backgrounds, he spoke openly about the dangers of prejudice, of how unchecked biases could warp even the most well-intentioned people. He shared how he had once thought of authority as a shield to protect himself and his own, but now saw it as a responsibility to protect everyone. As he told his story, Richard noticed the nods of understanding in the audience, the faces of young people listening intently. He hoped that, in sharing his failures, he could inspire others to choose a different path, to wield authority with integrity, to see each person as worthy of respect, and to understand that power without accountability would only lead to ruin. In the end, Richard had found a new sense of purpose, one rooted not in the power of his badge, but in the strength of his character. His journey had been painful, humbling, and transformative, a reminder that even those who fall can find redemption if they're willing to face the truth and make amends. And as he looked out over the audience, Richard finally understood that this was the legacy he wanted to leave. Not as a captain who wielded authority, but as a man who had learned to serve it with honor and humility.